mess? Who is in charge of it? Who is responsible?
Well, we are each responsible for the various responsibilities that we've been given under the MOU. The final decision on whether to put taxpayers' money at risk obviously belongs with the Chancellor. You would expect that. I don't have the authority to put taxpayers' money at risk. The responsibility for the design of the operations in markets that we carry out is our responsibility at the bank, and the judgment about individual institutions is that of the FSA.
But at that stage, we weren't aware of what was still to come, and that it was far deeper, it was systemic, and that the whole system was going to end up coming down.
The committee was highly sceptical of the system of regulation, and it was about to come under even more scrutiny. As their inquiries into the rock continued in the summer of 2008, the next credit crunch dominoes were about to fall.
Good evening. It's been a day of turmoil on the world's money markets after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one of America's biggest investment banks. Alan Greenspan, the former head of the US Federal Reserve, called it a once-in-a-century event.
It's 8 o'clock on Monday the 29th of September. The headlines this morning. The government's confirmed it's nationalising Bradford and Bingley. Its savings business is being sold to the Spanish group Santander.
It's 7 o'clock on Wednesday the 8th of October. Only one main headline today. The government is announcing that it's using up to £50 billion of taxpayers' money to partly nationalise Britain's leading bank. In the last few seconds, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has issued a statement which will, he hopes, rescue Britain's banks.
It's 8 o'clock on Monday the 13th of October. £37 billion of taxpayers' money is being pumped into three of our biggest banks. The government will have a majority stake in Royal Bank of Scotland. Senior directors have been told they won't receive cash bonuses this year.
After 10 years of a strong economy, the Chancellor, Alistair Darling, had arrived at the Treasury just as the credit crunch hit. Now, as one leg of the tripartite, he was having to defend the system his Prime Minister had set up.
I've been asked about this on. Well, I'm the Chancellor, and with me we have the Governor and the Chairman of the FSA.
He appeared before the committee for a unique hearing alongside the other heads of the tripartite. There'd already been a row in Parliament over the steps he'd taken. With the government's and the Prime Minister's personal credibility at issue, the political as well as the economic stakes were huge.
We have had to take a number of steps that in past years we might have thought to be extraordinary, like the nationalisation of Northern Rock at the beginning of this year. And you recall that even within Parliament that was deeply controversial at the time.
Nationalising a high street bank is not the way to begin, and we will oppose it tomorrow.
Yeah! We had a similar problem with Bradford and Bingley in September.
And 10 days ago we had to deal with the problems at Bradford and Bingley. We transferred the savings business, the branches and the related jobs to Abbey Santander, protecting savers, and took the rest of the company into public ownership.
And of course, since September, since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States, the problem became acute.
Until markets stabilise, the Bank of England will extend and widen its injections of funds into the system to build on the £40 billion it put in yesterday.
That's why it was necessary for us at the beginning of October to announce that we were going to embark on a major programme to help our banks recapitalise, to build up their strength so that we'll be able to continue to lend to each other, to businesses and to people.
Well, Alistair Darling was most unfortunate as a Chancellor in taking up the post and facing the biggest financial crisis that we've had.
He got off to an extremely shaky start, and the whole of his first year as Chancellor, he looked as if it was all going on around him. And to be frank, I really wondered whether he was coping.
I've always thought he's a very good parliamentary performer. He's almost impossible to rile. He's always very calm. He's always very patient. And I think probably over the piece, his stature has grown.
You and Mr. Brown were in overall charge of all this. I mean, why don't you accept responsibility and say sorry?
But I've said to you that I accept responsibility for everything that I'm responsible for. But in relation to what has been happening in the banking system overall, I think there are several levels of responsibility. Yes, in our national regulators. Undoubtedly, we needed to toughen up what was happening internationally. There's another area which we overlook at our peril, and that is the responsibility of boards of banks, who are supposed to be the first line of defence in relation to their own institution.
At the Financial Services Authority, Lord Turner was appointed chairman just as the banks were being buffeted by the storms. A former director of the CBI and a polished technocrat, Lord Turner underlined that it wasn't just the UK authorities that had been caught out.
I think, to be honest, it is an admission that at the level of the whole world there was a failure to see enormous risks developing in our financial system.
But in a later hearing, Lord Turner was explicitly critical of the system.
It fairly overtly said that it was not the function of the regulator to cast questions over the overall business strategy of the institution. Now, you may find that surprising, and I think with hindsight, I find it surprising, but that is the case. And I think it is also the case that that existed within a political philosophy where all the pressure on the FSA was not to say, are you looking more closely at these business models, but to say, why are you being so heavy and intrusive? Can't you make your regulation a bit more light touch?
But it wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be this perfectly honed piece of machinery that swung into action whenever there was any crisis, and everybody was supposed to liaise with everybody else. But it was clear that nobody was in overall charge, and there was no real mechanism for who should decide and under what circumstances that there was real systemic risk and how a rescue operation should be mounted.
The committee now turned its attention to the managers of two huge banks which had collapsed. RBS, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and HBOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland, had both been nationalised at vast cost to the taxpayer. And as the committee prepared to hear from the managers who'd been in charge of those institutions, public and media interest rose to fever pitch.
Well, it starts even before you get here. You come down the corridor, it's full of press, there's masses of public, there's the witnesses nervously chewing their nails, and you come in and we have our private meeting. You're aware of all that's been written the day before. The chairman calls for the public and the witnesses to be let in. There's a scramble for seats. The place is absolutely packed. Cameras on, scribes in every corner with notebooks out.
Lloyds, HBOS, Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays?
Hang on.
What's left?
I'm on Planet Reality.
Former Conservative MP and Treasury Minister Angela Knight is a practised witness at select committees, and she's now the spokesman for the banking industry.
This is real adversarial stuff. You know, you've got the crowd cheering on one side. You know, you've got the gladiators. You've got, you're in the bear pit. It's all that type of environment, and so it did become pretty compulsive.
Well, the public clearly wanted to know how these major British institutions had come to the point of collapse, and wanted to know why so much public money had to be put into them when they had these apparently very respectable, high-powered boards of directors and were boasting that they were world-class financial institutions. And I think people just couldn't understand how they'd got into so much trouble. So that was what was unique about the session. It was really the first chance to confront these people right at the top and say, how on earth did this sort of thing happen?
Can you introduce yourselves, please, starting with Lord Stevenson?
The most famous of the four in tabloid terms was Sir Fred Goodwin, known as Fred the Shred because of his ferocious cost-cutting. He had overseen the rapid expansion of RBS and its even faster collapse. The MPs had sharpened their soundbites.
But a lot of the press previous to the report hearings was stating that they were going to apologise. So the first question obviously was, is sorry the hardest part?
We are profoundly, and I think I would say unreservedly, sorry at the turn of events.
In November of last year, I made a full apology, unreserved apology, both personally and on behalf of the board, and I'm very happy to repeat that this morning.
Apologised in full, and I'm happy to do so again at the public meeting of our shareholders back in November. And I too would echo Dennis Stevenson's comments and Tom's comments that there is a profound and unqualified apology for all of the distress that has been caused. We